The lake stretched out like a sheet of glass under the early morning sun, its surface so still it seemed to hold its breath. I'd driven 3 hours from the city, my pickup rattling over the gravel roads of upstate New York, chasing the promise of quiet at my family's cabin. This place had been my refuge since I was a kid, a sanctuary built by my grandfather's hands, where the only worries were whether the trout were biting or if the firewood would last the weekend. But as I stepped onto the porch that morning, a bright red sign slapped across the door shattered any hope of peace. Ecological Protection Zone. No entry. My name is Tom Harlan, and I'm the owner of this cabin. Yet, standing there in my faded Syracuse University t-shirt and jeans, I felt like a trespasser on my own land. Before I could process the sign, a woman appeared at the foot of the porch steps, her neon green blazer glaring in the sunlight like a warning flare. She clutched a thick manila folder, her red lipstick curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Harlan, I presume?" Her voice dripped with the kind of forced politeness that sets your nerves on edge, the tone of someone about to upend your life with a clipboard and a grudge. "I'm Cynthia Reynolds, president of the Clear Lake Homeowners Association. We need to discuss some serious violations on your property." Cynthia gestured at the cabin as if it were a crime scene, her manicured nails flashing. The place was a sturdy log structure, weathered but solid, built in 1982 by my grandfather, a man who'd poured his heart into every plank. It had survived blizzards, floods, and 40 years of family memories without a single complaint from the county. But Cynthia's folder, stuffed with official-looking documents, suggested otherwise. She flipped it open with the flair of a courtroom lawyer, her eyes darting to a small recorder in her hand, as if she were collecting evidence for a trial. "Violations," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Ma'am, this cabin's been here for decades. We've passed every inspection the county's ever thrown at us. What's this about?" Her smile widened, sharp as a blade. "Your property is now under the expanded jurisdiction of our Watershed Protection Zone," she said, reading from a document that bristled with legal jargon. "We've detected contamination, improper sewage disposal, unauthorized alterations to natural water flow, and soil samples showing dangerous pollutants. These pose a direct threat to our community's water supply." The accusations hit like a punch. I'm a hydrological engineer, someone who spent 15 years designing systems to protect water sources, not pollute them. The irony was almost laughable, but the sight of a news van parked discreetly down the road, half hidden by pines, killed any humor. This wasn't a neighborly dispute. This was a setup, orchestrated to make me look like the villain in a story I hadn't even read yet. "Let's be clear," I said, crossing my arms. "I'll need to verify your HOA's authority with the county, and I want copies of those soil samples and reports before I respond to any of this." Cynthia's smile flickered, just for a second, like a predator caught off guard. She handed me a business card, her nails clicking against the paper. "You have 48 hours to begin compliance, Mr. Harlan, or we'll escalate this through legal channels." "Oh, and the State Environmental Agency has already been notified. Expect to hear from them." She turned on her heels impossibly high for a gravel driveway and strode back to her car. The news van vanished as quickly as she did, confirming my suspicion that this was a coordinated hit. I went inside, the cabin's familiar pine scent doing little to calm my shaking hands as I brewed coffee. The land, 20 acres of pristine woodland next to a state conservation area, had been in my family since before the HOA existed. The idea that some new organization could claim control over it, especially with a grandfather clause protecting our rights, seemed absurd. But as I sat on the porch, staring at the lake's calm surface, I remembered something my grandfather had said about the secret of the stream. He'd always been vague, almost poetic, but now I wondered if he'd been hinting at something far more practical. By evening, the situation spiraled into a nightmare. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, a link to a blog post titled, "Environmental Engineer Caught Poisoning Local Water Supply." The article, written by a so-called independent journalist named Ethan Caldwell, painted me as a hypocrite who preached conservation while dumping sewage into protected wetlands. The photos of my cabin, taken from angles that made it look sinister, were already circulating online. By noon the next day, my boss at the engineering firm called, his voice tight. "Tom, maybe take some leave until this blows over. The optics aren't good." The accusations were meticulously crafted, blending just enough technical detail to sound credible with vague claims I couldn't easily refute. Social media amplified the mess, with strangers labeling me a fraud and a criminal. Comments like, This is why you can't trust engineers, and he's poisoning our kids' water. Piled up, each one a dagger to my reputation. Then came the text from Cynthia herself, forwarding the worst of the online vitriol with notes like, "Thought you'd want to see what your neighbors think." It was psychological warfare, designed to break me into signing whatever she wanted just to make it stop. But her cruelty revealed a flaw. Cynthia didn't just want to wish, she wanted to see me suffer. That vindictiveness was a weakness I could exploit if I could find a way to fight back without drowning in her legal and media machine. Late that night, as I sat in a cramped motel room too paranoid to stay at the cabin, I got a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at Daisy's Diner, 7 a.m. tomorrow. I have info you need. Come alone. LW." I stared at the message, my mind racing. Was this another trap or a lifeline? Sleep didn't come easy, but when it did, I dreamed of my grandfather's voice, low and steady, saying, "Every stream has a source, Tom. Go upstream to find the truth." The next morning, I sat in a booth at Daisy's Diner, a greasy spoon off the highway with checkered floors and coffee that tasted like burnt ambition. A woman slid into the seat across from me, her eyes darting to the door like she expected trouble. She introduced herself as Laura Wheeler, the HOA's part-time secretary. Her hands trembled as she pushed a manila envelope across the table. "Cynthia's not just targeting you," she whispered. "She's after everyone whose land sits on the underground aquifer that feeds the lake. She's got a deal with Blue Ridge Water Corp to sell them extraction rights, but she needs to control the upstream properties first." The envelope was a gold mine. Contracts, emails, financial records. Cynthia had been running a scheme for 2 years, targeting 7 property owners along the aquifer. Each had faced similar environmental accusations, followed by media smear campaigns that forced them to sell their land to the HOA at fire sale prices. I was just the latest mark in a multi-million-dollar hustle that ruined families while lining Cynthia's pockets. Laura's documents also revealed Cynthia's lawyer, Richard Grayson, a specialist in exploiting obscure environmental laws to bully small property owners. Their strategy was ruthless. File complaints with multiple agencies, leak selective info to friendly journalists like Ethan, then offer to settle if the owner sold cheap. Most victims, overwhelmed by legal costs and public shaming, gave in. But Cynthia had miscalculated with me. As an engineer, I knew the science she was twisting, and I had professional contacts she hadn't anticipated. The real bombshell was Laura's evidence of Cynthia's own environmental crimes. The HOA's improvement project's decorative ponds, irrigation systems were dumping construction waste into natural sinkholes, polluting the very aquifer Cynthia claimed to protect. She'd been framing others for her own violations, a level of hypocrisy that made my blood boil. But fighting back meant navigating a minefield. Cynthia's next move arrived that afternoon, a court order demanding I vacate the cabin within 24 hours for an environmental assessment. The document looked real: seals, signatures, the works, but something about the formatting nagged at me. 3 hours on the phone with the county clerk confirmed my suspicion. It was a fake, a felony fraud Cynthia and Grayson were betting I wouldn't check. Then came the enforcement officers, 2 men in uniforms with badges that screamed authority. They demanded I leave immediately, but when I asked for credentials and threatened to call the sheriff, they bolted. They were private security, hired by Grayson to intimidate me. Cynthia was escalating, and I knew her next move would be bigger, bolder, and designed to crush me. The motel room smelled of stale coffee and desperation, the kind of place where dreams went to die alongside cigarette burns on the carpet. I sat on the sagging bed, the manila envelope from Laura Wheeler spread out before me like a battle map. Her documents were a roadmap to Cynthia Reynolds' corruption, contracts with Blue Ridge Water Corp, falsified environmental reports, and a paper trail of bribes to local officials. But it was the photographs of illegal dumping sites, construction debris clogging natural sinkholes that lit a fire in me. Cynthia wasn't just framing me for environmental crimes. She was poisoning the very lake system my grandfather had spent his life protecting. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast, because Cynthia's fake court order and hired goons were just the opening act. As I pored over Laura's evidence, my grandfather's words echoed in my mind. "Every stream has a source, Tom. Go upstream to find the truth." He'd always spoken of the secret of the stream. When we fished together, his voice low and reverent, like he was sharing a piece of ancient wisdom. I'd thought it was just his way of romanticizing the land, but now I suspected it was something more, something tangible. I drove back to the cabin under the cover of dusk, avoiding the main road where Cynthia's news van might still be lurking. The red warning sign still hung on the door, mocking me, but I ignored it and headed to the old stone foundation in the basement, where my grandfather kept his private papers. Tucked inside a rusted metal box, wrapped in oiled cloth, I found it. A leather-bound notebook filled with his precise engineer's handwriting. My grandfather, Henry Harlan, had been a civil engineer with the Army Corps of Engineers before building this cabin. The notebook wasn't just a sentimental keepsake, it was a detailed survey of the underground aquifer that fed the entire lake region. Page after page of technical drawings mapped out streams, tributaries, and natural cisterns, with notes on pressure release points that controlled water flow across thousands of acres. The cabin sat at the heart of it all, a critical junction where three major underground streams converged before feeding the lake. He'd discovered this in 1985 while digging the cabin's well, but he'd kept it secret, knowing the power it held. The drawings showed more than just water flow. They revealed a system of natural controls he'd engineered, strategically placed stones, modified drainage channels, and landscaping that looked random but could redirect water if the system was threatened. It was like finding out our quiet family retreat was the control room for a vast hydrological network. If Cynthia got her hands on this land, she wouldn't just sell water rights to Blue Rajesh, could manipulate the entire regional water supply, turning wetlands into dust and farmlands into flood zones for profit. The weight of it hit me hard. This wasn't just about saving my cabin or clearing my name. It was about protecting an ecosystem that supported three communities, wetlands that prevented flooding, and forests that sheltered wildlife. Cynthia's scheme was a slow-motion disaster, and I was the only one who knew the full scope of what she was messing with. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. I needed allies, and I needed evidence that could stand up to her legal and media machine. The next morning, I drove to the edge of the lake to meet George Ramsey, a retired plumber who lived 2 properties over. George was a wiry old man with hands like sandpaper and eyes that missed nothing. He'd known my grandfather for 40 years, and when I showed him the notebook, his face lit up like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Henry swore me to secrecy," he said, leading me to his cluttered basement, where he kept his own records of the local water system. But I figured someone in the family ought to know the truth. George's files were a revelation. He'd been documenting Cynthia's improvements to the HOA property's decorative ponds, underground irrigation systems that were disrupting the natural aquifer. Worse, he had photos of her crews dumping concrete rubble and construction waste into sinkholes, thinking they were just empty pits. Those sinkholes, George explained, were natural pressure valves for the underground streams. Block them, and the water would find another path, potentially flooding half the county while drying up the rest. The contamination Cynthia blamed on my septic system? It was runoff from her own illegal dumping, deliberately channeled to frame me. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it gave me a weapon. If I could expose her crimes, her entire narrative would collapse. The challenge was doing it without getting buried under her lawsuits or smeared by her journalist, Ethan Caldwell. Speaking of Ethan, he showed up at George's house that afternoon, looking like a man who just realized he'd been played. His flannel shirt and scruffy beard screamed authentic outdoorsman, but his eyes were haunted. "I thought I was exposing a polluter," he said, his voice low. "But my editor's been taking payments from a PR firm tied to Blue Ridge. I've been pushing their lies." Ethan's confession was a game-changer. He'd been fed a script by Cynthia's team, complete with doctored photos and cherry-picked data to paint me as the villain. Now, he wanted to make it right, but he was scared of losing his career, scared of the threats Cynthia's allies had made against his family. I saw an opportunity. An insider who knew how her media machine worked and had access to the same networks she'd used to destroy me. We formed an unlikely team: the embattled engineer, George, the grizzled plumber with a grudge, Laura, the nervous whistleblower, and Ethan, the repentant journalist. Our plan was simple but risky: use Cynthia's own tactics against her. Instead of confronting her directly, which would give her time to cover her tracks, we'd gather undeniable evidence of her crimes and let the natural water system expose her. My grandfather's notebook was the key. His controls could restore the aquifer's natural flow, undoing Cynthia's disruptions. If we timed it right, the next big rain would carry her illegal waste right onto her pristine HOA properties, proving her guilt in a way no lawyer could spin. The first step was documentation. Working at night to avoid Cynthia's private security patrols, George guided us through the woods to her dumping sites. We photographed piles of concrete, rebar, and chemical barrels, taking water samples that showed dangerous levels of heavy metals and petroleum. Ethan used his press credentials to get us access to HOA schedules, ensuring we avoided surveillance cameras. Laura's administrative access gave us copies of Cynthia's falsified water quality reports, which she'd been submitting to regulators to cover her tracks. Each piece of evidence was a brick in the wall we were building to bring her down. The engineering part was where I came in. My grandfather's notebook showed exactly which stones and drainage channels Cynthia had blocked. By removing them, we could restore the aquifer's natural flow, letting the water carry her contamination back to her properties. It wasn't sabotage, it was restoration, undoing the damage she'd caused. But the real genius was psychological. Cynthia's power came from her image as an environmental crusader. If her properties flooded with toxic runoff during her next big press event, she'd either have to admit her crimes or keep lying while standing in her own mess. Either way, her credibility would implode. Ethan's intel revealed Cynthia's next move, a press conference on her flagship HOA property, where she'd announced the successful cleanup of the lake area, complete with fake water tests and paid-off residents. The irony was almost too perfect. We scheduled our work for 3 nights before her event, giving the aquifer time to stabilize but not enough for her to notice. George knew every trail in these woods, and his guidance kept us invisible as we worked under moonlight, moving stones and clearing channels with hand tools to avoid detection. By dawn, the system was reset, and the only sign of our presence was the absence of Cynthia's artificial barriers. As we hiked back to George's place, I felt a connection to my grandfather I hadn't known since I was a kid fishing with him. His notebook wasn't just a map, it was a legacy, a blueprint for protecting this land. But the stakes were higher than I'd imagined. If we'd miscalculated, the flooding could harm innocent residents, not just Cynthia's properties. The line between justice and revenge was blurring, and I wondered if I was becoming as ruthless as the woman I was fighting. That morning, the first raindrops fell, soft and warm, the kind that usually made me want to sit on the cabin porch with a beer. But this was no ordinary rain. The weather forecast predicted a major storm, 3 to 4 inches of water in 24 hours, perfect conditions to test our work. Cynthia had no idea her manicured lawns were about to become a swamp of her own making, exposing the truth she'd buried for years. The rain started as a whisper, tapping gently on the motel room window where I'd been holed up for days. By noon, it was a steady drumbeat, the kind of spring downpour that turned dirt roads to mud and made the lake ripple like a living thing. I sat by the window, my grandfather's notebook open on the table, its pages of precise diagrams a reminder of the gamble we'd taken. 3 nights ago, George Ramsey, Ethan Caldwell, Laura Wheeler, and I had reset the underground aquifer's natural flow, removing the barriers Cynthia Reynolds had built to hide her illegal dumping. Now, with a storm rolling in, the truth was about to surface literally. But as the rain intensified, so did my doubts. Had I gone too far? Would innocent people pay the price for my fight against Cynthia's corruption? The weather forecast had been clear, 3 to 4 inches of rain in 24 hours, a deluge that would test the aquifer's restored channels. My grandfather's designs were flawless, engineered to handle exactly this kind of storm. The water would follow its original paths, carrying Cynthia's toxic waste, concrete rubble, chemical barrels, and petroleum sludge from her hidden dump sites onto her pristine HOA properties. Her press conference, scheduled for tomorrow, was meant to be a victory lap, a staged event to proclaim her successful cleanup of the lake area. Instead, it would be her undoing, assuming everything went according to plan. But plans have a way of unraveling. Around 2:30 p.m., my phone buzzed with a call from George. "It's starting," he said, his voice tight with excitement and worry. "Water's bubbling up through the stone pathways in Cynthia's showpiece garden. Smells like a chemical spill. You need to see this." I grabbed my raincoat and drove to a vantage point overlooking the HOA's main property, a manicured estate with white fences and a community center that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The rain was relentless now, turning the grassy lawns into a slick mess. Through my binoculars, I saw dark, oily water seeping up through the pathways, pooling around the base of a decorative fountain Cynthia had bragged about in her newsletters. The stench George mentioned was faint but unmistakable, even from a distance, a sharp, chemical bite that had no business in a protected watershed. By 3 p.m., the situation escalated. The HOA's community center, where Cynthia had planned her press conference, was taking on water. 6 inches of contaminated runoff had flooded the basement, forcing her to relocate the event to the local library. Ethan was already there, his camera rolling, capturing footage of the chaos. He texted me updates. Water's flowing across the playground. Residents are freaking out. Cynthia's trying to spin it, but she's losing control. The beauty of our plan was its simplicity. We hadn't created the flooding, we just let the aquifer do what it was designed to do. Cynthia's illegal dumping had blocked natural sinkholes, forcing water into artificial channels that framed people like me for pollution. By removing those blocks, we'd let the water follow its true path, carrying her crimes to the surface. It was poetic justice, but it came with a cost. As I watched the water rise, I thought about the families living in the HOA's properties, people who had no idea their homes were built on a lie. If the flooding damaged their houses, would they blame me as much as Cynthia? Ethan's footage was gold. He sent me a clip of Cynthia standing in her signature lime green blazer, now splattered with mud, trying to reassure a crowd of angry residents. "This is a temporary issue," she said, her voice strained. "We're addressing it with the utmost urgency." But the water at her feet told a different story, its oily sheen and chemical odor betraying the truth. Ethan zoomed in on a storm drain where discolored water gushed out, a visual indictment no amount of PR could erase. The Environmental Protection Agency arrived by 4 p.m., not because of Cynthia's fake reports, but because residents had called about strange smells and discolored water. The EPA team, in their yellow hazmat suits, moved with the efficiency of people who'd seen this kind of mess before. They took samples, traced the water's path, and within an hour, they'd found one of Cynthia's dumping sites, a sinkhole stuffed with construction debris, now overflowing with toxic runoff. Laura's documents had given us the exact locations, and George's photos matched the EPA's findings perfectly. Cynthia's house of cards was starting to wobble. But she wasn't done fighting. Around 5 p.m., as the rain pounded harder, Cynthia held an impromptu press conference at the library. Flanked by her lawyer, Richard Grayson, she doubled down, blaming rogue property owners, like me, for the flooding. "Certain individuals have tampered with our carefully maintained drainage systems," she said, her eyes locking onto the cameras. "We're working with authorities to hold them accountable." It was a bold lie, but her delivery was flawless, and I could see some reporters nodding along. She was betting on her reputation to carry her through, counting on people to believe her over a disgraced engineer like me. Back at the motel, I watched the live broadcast on a local news channel, my stomach churning. Cynthia's ability to twist the truth was almost admirable, but it also made her dangerous. If she could convince the public I'd caused this mess, my career and reputation would be finished for good. Ethan texted me, "She's throwing everything at you. We need to move fast." That's when Laura called with a bombshell. She'd been digging through more HOA records and found proof that Cynthia had been falsifying water quality reports for over a year. The data she'd submitted to the EPA claimed the lake was pristine, but her own internal memos admitted the dumping sites were leaking toxins. "She knew," Laura said, her voice shaking. "She's been covering it up while framing people like you. If the EPA sees this, she's done." The evidence was mounting, but we needed to present it carefully. A direct confrontation would give Cynthia and Grayson time to shred documents or bribe more officials. Instead, we decided to let the storm do the talking. The water was already exposing her crimes, and Ethan's footage would make sure the world saw it. But the moral weight of our plan was starting to hit me. The flooding wasn't just ruining Cynthia's property, it was disrupting lives. Families were evacuating, their homes threatened by the same water I'd helped unleash. Was I any better than Cynthia if my actions hurt innocent people? George, ever the pragmatist, waved off my concerns. "You didn't create this mess, Tom." "She did. You're just letting the truth come out." But his words didn't erase the knot in my chest. Justice was supposed to feel clean, not like a wrecking ball that took out bystanders. I thought of my grandfather, who'd spent his life protecting this land. Would he have approved of this, or would he have found another way? As night fell, the rain showed no sign of stopping. I drove to the cabin, needing to see the lake for myself. The water was higher than I'd ever seen it, lapping at the edges of the dock where I used to fish with my grandfather. His notebook had been right. The aquifer was doing exactly what he'd mapped out decades ago, redirecting water through its natural channels. But the scale of it was overwhelming. The lake was swelling, fed by streams that had been choked for years. Somewhere out there, Cynthia's empire was drowning in her own lies. Ethan called just before midnight. "The EPA's expanding their investigation," he said. "They found a second dumping site, and it's worse than the first. Heavy metals, industrial solvents, the works. They're calling it a public health crisis. He paused, then added, Cynthia's starting to crack. She canceled tomorrow's press conference. I think she knows it's over. But I wasn't so sure. Cynthia was a fighter, and people like her didn't go down easily. She'd already tried fake court orders and hired goons. What was next? I lay awake that night, the rain hammering the motel roof, wondering if I'd underestimated her. My grandfather's voice came back to me. Go upstream to find the truth. I was upstream now, but the truth was messier than I'd expected. The line between right and wrong was getting harder to see, and I had a sinking feeling that Cynthia had one last card to play. The rain hadn't stopped by morning, a relentless gray curtain that turned the lake into a churning beast. From my motel room, I watched news reports of flooding across the Clear Lake HOA properties, where Cynthia Reynolds' manicured lawns had become swamps of toxic sludge. The Environmental Protection Agency was swarming the area, their hazmat suits a stark contrast to the pastel homes they were inspecting. My grandfather's aquifer, freed from Cynthia's artificial barriers, was doing exactly what we'd planned, carrying her illegal waste to the surface, exposing her crimes in a way no press release could deny. But as I sipped bitter motel coffee, the victory felt hollow. The same water that was drowning Cynthia's empire was displacing families who'd done nothing wrong. Had I crossed a line from justice to vengeance? Ethan Caldwell called at 7 a.m., his voice buzzing with adrenaline. Tom, it's chaos out here. The EPA found a third dumping site, barrels of industrial solvents buried under the HOA's new playground. Residents are furious. Cynthia's holed up in her office, dodging reporters. He sent me a clip of his latest footage. Cynthia, her lime green blazer now a muddy ruin, trying to wave off cameras as she climbed into a car. The chemical stench from the flooded properties was so strong it carried on the wind, and residents were taping signs to their doors demanding answers. Ethan's camera caught one perfectly. Who's poisoning our kids? The irony wasn't lost on me. Cynthia had built her campaign against me on that same question, accusing me of endangering the community while she was the one dumping toxins into the aquifer. But the collateral damage was real. News reports showed families packing up, their homes uninhabitable until the EPA could clean up the mess. A woman on TV, clutching a toddler, cried as she described losing family photos to the flood. I'd wanted to expose Cynthia, but I hadn't meant for innocent people to suffer. George Ramsay's words echoed in my head. You didn't create this mess, Tom, but they didn't ease the guilt gnawing at me. Laura Wheeler met me at Daisy's diner that morning, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. She slid another envelope across the table, this one thicker than the last. These are the final nails in Cynthia's coffin, she said. Bank records showing payments to local officials, fake invoices for environmental consulting, and emails where she admits to rigging water tests. The documents were damning. Cynthia had bribed county inspectors to ignore her dumping sites, paid a PR firm to feed Ethan's editor false stories, and orchestrated a system to fleece property owners like me. She'd turned environmental protection into a criminal enterprise, and now the evidence was overwhelming. But Cynthia wasn't going down without a fight. By noon, she'd launched a counterattack. A new blog post, credited to an anonymous, concerned resident, claimed the flooding was sabotage by disgruntled property owners who'd tampered with the HOA's drainage systems. My name wasn't mentioned directly, but the implication was clear. Worse, Cynthia's lawyer, Richard Grayson, filed an emergency injunction with the county court, demanding the EPA halt their investigation until external interference could be ruled out. It was a desperate move, but it bought her time to shred documents, bribe more officials, or spin a new narrative. Ethan was livid. She's trying to pin this on you again, he said over the phone. But I've got her on tape admitting to a reporter that the HOA's water tests were exaggerated for effect. She didn't know I was recording. His footage was a goldmine, but we had to be strategic. If we released it too soon, Cynthia's legal team could bury it in countersuits. We needed to wait for the perfect moment, when her lies were so exposed that no amount of lawyering could save her. That moment came sooner than expected. At 2 p.m., the EPA issued a public statement. The flooding had uncovered systemic environmental violations on HOA properties, including illegal dumping of heavy metals and industrial chemicals. The contamination levels were so high that 2 local schools were closed and 12 families were evacuated. The statement didn't name Cynthia directly, but it referenced falsified regulatory reports and promised a full investigation. Social media erupted, with residents turning on the HOA. Hashtags like Clear Lake Cover-Up and Stop the Poison trended locally, and Cynthia's carefully crafted image as an environmental protector began to crumble. I drove to George's house to regroup. He was in his basement, surrounded by maps and photos, looking like a general planning a final assault. "The water's doing its job," he said, pointing to a topographic map marked with my grandfather's notes. "Those sinkholes she filled are overflowing, and the runoff's hitting her properties hardest. The EPA's tracing it back to her." But he frowned, his weathered face creasing. "Problem is, the flooding's spreading. Some folks down the road lost their basements. They're not happy, Tom." The guilt hit harder now. My grandfather's system was working perfectly, but it was a blunt instrument. The aquifer didn't care who lived where. I just followed the path we'd cleared. I thought of the woman on TV, her toddler in her arms, and wondered if I'd become the kind of person who justified collateral damage for the greater good. Was this what my grandfather meant by protecting the land? Or had I twisted his legacy into something darker? Laura had an answer, though it wasn't comforting. "You didn't poison the water, Tom. Cynthia did. If you hadn't acted, she'd have sold the aquifer to Blue Ridge, and the whole region would be a wasteland in 10 years. Her logic was sound, but it didn't erase the faces of those displaced families. I needed to finish this, not just for me, but for them to make sure Cynthia's crimes were fully exposed and the cleanup was done right. Ethan's next call brought a new twist. "I got a tip from a source inside Blue Ridge," he said. "They're cutting ties with Cynthia. Their CEO's panicking, trying to avoid a federal investigation. They're leaking documents to distance themselves, and guess what? They show Cynthia promised them exclusive water rights in exchange for a 7-figure payout. The documents, emailed anonymously to Ethan, detailed a deal where Blue Ridge would extract billions of gallons from the aquifer, leaving the lake and wetlands dry. Cynthia had been playing a bigger game than any of us realized, and now her corporate partners were abandoning her to save themselves. We decided to strike while the iron was hot. Ethan would release his footage and Blue Ridge's documents to a major news outlet, one outside Cynthia's influence. Laura would hand her financial records to the EPA, ensuring they had a complete picture of the fraud. George and I would keep monitoring the aquifer, documenting any new evidence of contamination as the floodwaters spread. But the clock was ticking. Cynthia's injunction could stall the EPA, and if she got wind of our plan, she'd disappear with whatever money she'd already stashed. That evening, I returned to the cabin, needing to feel grounded. The lake was still swollen, its surface a mirror of the storm clouds above. I opened my grandfather's notebook again, tracing his diagrams of the aquifer. He built this place not just as a retreat, but as a safeguard for the entire region. His secret of the stream wasn't just about water, it was about responsibility, about standing up to those who'd exploit the land for profit. I was honoring that, wasn't I? Or had I let anger cloud my judgment, turning a fight for justice into a personal vendetta? The answer came at midnight, when Ethan texted me a link to a breaking news story. His outlet had published the footage of Cynthia's admission, alongside Blue Ridge's leaked documents. The headline was brutal: HOA president caught in toxic dumping scandal. The story detailed her bribes, her fake reports, and her deal with Blue Ridge, backed by Ethan's video and Laura's financial records. By morning, it was everywhere: local TV, national blogs, even trending on social media. Cynthia's name was poisoned now, her green blazer a symbol of corruption rather than authority. But she made one last move. At 6 a.m., I got a call from an unknown number. It was Cynthia, her voice low and venomous. "You think you've won, Harlan? I've got lawyers who'll bury you in court for years. You'll lose everything: your cabin, your job, your name." She hung up before I could respond, but her desperation was clear. She was cornered, and cornered animals fight hardest. I met George, Laura, and Ethan at Daisy's diner to plan our final steps. The EPA was moving fast now, seizing Cynthia's dumping sites and issuing subpoenas for her financial records. But we needed to ensure the public saw the full truth before she could spin another lie. Ethan was already editing a follow-up story, combining his footage with George's photos and my grandfather's maps to show how Cynthia had manipulated the aquifer. Laura was preparing to testify to the EPA, risking her own safety to expose the bribe she'd uncovered. As we sat there, the rain finally slowed, leaving a heavy silence. The aquifer was settling, but the damage was done not just to Cynthia's properties, but to the community she betrayed. I thought of my grandfather, who'd taught me that protecting the land meant protecting the people who depended on it. Had I done that? Or had I let my need to stop Cynthia blind me to the cost? The question lingered, heavy as the storm clouds still hanging over the lake. The rain had stopped, leaving the lake region cloaked in a damp, uneasy calm. The Clear Lake HOA properties, once a postcard of suburban perfection, were now a disaster zone. Yellow hazmat tape crisscrossing lawns, EPA crews in protective suits collecting samples, and news vans circling like vultures. Cynthia Reynolds' empire of lies was collapsing, her toxic dumping exposed by the very aquifer she'd tried to exploit. But as I stood on the porch of my grandfather's cabin, watching the lake settle under a gray dawn, I couldn't shake the weight of what I'd done. Exposing Cynthia had brought justice, but it had also upended lives, families displaced, homes damaged, futures uncertain. Had I honored my grandfather's legacy, or had I crossed into a moral gray zone where the ends justified the means? The morning news was relentless. Ethan Caldwell's expose, backed by Laura Wheeler's financial records and George Ramsey's photos, had gone viral. The headline, HOA President's Toxic Scheme Poison Community, was plastered across every local channel and picked up by national outlets. Ethan's footage of Cynthia standing in contaminated water, her lime green blazer stained with the evidence of her crimes, was replayed endlessly. Social media amplified the outrage, with residents demanding accountability and the hashtag ClearLake cover-up trending nationwide. Laura's documents, now in the hands of the EPA, detailed a criminal enterprise, bribes to county officials, falsified water quality reports, and a multi-million-dollar deal with Blue Ridge Water Corp to sell off the aquifer's rights. Cynthia's lawyer, Richard Grayson, was scrambling, but no amount of legal maneuvering could hide the truth now. By 9 a.m., the EPA issued a formal statement. The contamination from Cynthia's dumping sites posed an immediate public health threat. 2 schools remained closed, 12 families were relocated to temporary housing, and cleanup costs were estimated at over $4 million. The statement confirmed what George had warned about. Cynthia's blocked sinkholes had disrupted the aquifer, causing toxic runoff to spread across the HOA properties. My grandfather's system, restored by our midnight work, had forced that runoff to the surface, exposing her crimes in a way no courtroom could have. But the collateral damage haunted me. Those families hadn't asked for this, and their losses were as real as Cynthia's guilt. I met George, Laura, and Ethan at Daisy's Diner to plan our final moves. Cynthia's last-ditch phone call threatening years of lawsuits still echoed in my mind. She was cornered, but people like her didn't surrender quietly. Laura, nursing a coffee, looked resolute despite her exhaustion. The EPA's subpoenaing her bank records, she said. They've got enough to charge her with environmental crimes, mail fraud, and racketeering. She's looking at 20 years. Ethan nodded, editing his next story on a laptop. I'm working with a national outlet to tie Blue Ridge to the scandal. Their CEO's already under investigation for bribery. George, ever the pragmatist, leaned back in the booth. She's done, Tom. The water told the truth, just like your granddad said it would. But his eyes softened as he added, I know you're worried about the folks caught in the crossfire. That's why we've got to make sure this cleanup happens right for them, not just for us. He was right, but the moral ambiguity gnawed at me. My grandfather, Henry Harlan, had built this cabin to protect the aquifer, not to weaponize it. His notebook, with its meticulous diagrams of streams and pressure points, was a testament to stewardship, not revenge. By restoring the aquifer's flow, I'd exposed Cynthia, but I'd also flooded homes that didn't deserve it. The line between justice and retribution was razor-thin, and I wasn't sure which side I'd landed on. The legal hammer fell that afternoon. The EPA, armed with Laura's records and George's photos, issued a warrant for Cynthia's arrest. Federal agents raided her office, seizing computers and files while reporters swarmed outside. By evening, she was in custody, charged with a laundry list of crimes: environmental violations, conspiracy to defraud government agencies, and racketeering. Richard Grayson faced his own charges for creating fake court orders and orchestrating the intimidation of property owners. Blue Ridge Water Corp, desperate to avoid liability, released a statement disavowing Cynthia, but their leaked documents ensured they'd face their own reckoning. The HOA itself was dissolved within days. Its budget, built on fraudulent property seizures and corporate kickbacks, couldn't withstand the scrutiny. Cleanup crews moved in, draining contaminated water and excavating dumping sites under EPA supervision. The financial penalties were staggering: Cynthia was ordered to pay $2.7 million in restitution, though her assets were frozen, and she'd likely never cover the full cost. The burden fell to taxpayers, a bitter pill that underscored the real cost of her greed. I returned to the cabin that night, needing its familiar walls to ground me. The lake was calm now, its surface reflecting the stars like it had when I was a kid. I opened my grandfather's notebook, tracing his handwriting. He'd known this land held power, not just for our family, but for the thousands of people who depended on its water. His secret of the stream wasn't just about engineering, it was about responsibility, about protecting something bigger than yourself. I'd stopped Cynthia, but at what cost? The families displaced by the flooding, the homes damaged by my actions, they were the human price of justice, and I couldn't ignore that. The aftermath brought clarity, but not peace. My engineering firm welcomed me back with apologies and a promotion, recognizing my role in exposing a major environmental scandal. Ethan's expose won a state journalism award, restoring my reputation and sparking a broader conversation about how environmental concerns can be weaponized by corrupt players. Laura, hailed as a whistleblower, found a new job with a local nonprofit, her courage finally outweighing her fear. George, true to form, went back to his quiet life, though he promised to keep an eye on the aquifer, just in case. The cleanup took 8 months, costing taxpayers millions that could have gone to schools or roads. Cynthia served 18 months in federal prison before being released on probation, her reputation and fortune gone. She moved to another state, likely to reinvent herself where her name wasn't synonymous with scandal. I wondered if she'd learned anything, or if she was already scheming her next hustle. The aquifer, meanwhile, flowed freely again, its natural channels supporting wetlands and wildlife as my grandfather had intended. I set up a monitoring station in the cabin's basement, collecting data to help scientists track the system's recovery and prepare for future threats like climate change or development. 2 years later, I got a letter from a property owner in Ohio facing a similar nightmare. Fake environmental violations, media smears, and pressure to sell to a shady HOA. The tactics were eerily familiar, suggesting Cynthia might have been part of a larger network. I spent a weekend helping them build a defense, connecting them with environmental experts to debunk the claims. It made me realize this fight wasn't over, not for me, and not for the countless others targeted by similar schemes. Protecting the environment meant protecting it from everyone: corporations, officials, even activists who twisted its cause for profit. As I sit on the cabin porch now, watching the lake catch the sunset's glow, I'm struck by how this experience changed me. Justice isn't clean or simple. It's a messy, costly thing that demands you weigh every choice against its human toll. My grandfather taught me that stewardship is about more than preserving land. It's about standing up to those who'd exploit it, whether they're dumping chemicals or wielding fake morality. The underground streams still flow, carrying the memory of this fight, washing away the lies that nearly destroyed a community. They remind me that truth, like water, always finds a way to the surface. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. This story raises tough questions about violence and injustice. Where do you draw the line between fighting for what's right and causing harm to achieve it? Was Tom justified in his actions, even if innocent people suffered? Have you ever faced a situation where standing up to injustice came with a moral cost? Share your perspective, and let's get a conversation going about how we confront corruption and protect what matters most.